My name is Brian Hirsch. I run an accelerator program called 30 to 80, helping people who work in government digitize and improve public services. And thanks for tuning in today. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have here in just a minute. Talking to some folks that I've worked with in the past from Zealous, Jenny Graham and Maureen Valdez. About working, the interactions between folks in the call center and the product organization. The theme of this live stream is, to shine a bright spotlight on success stories, places where people who've done the hard work in government have had successes and have insights that are worth sharing and replicating, so that we can all be spending our precious time and headaches on solving new problems rather than already solved problems. And so in that spirit, I'm really excited to bring on today's guests and introduce you to them. All right, Maureen and Jenny, welcome.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks so much for being here. So why don't I give you a chance to just introduce yourselves briefly and tell us a little bit about what Zealous does. And then there's so much that I'm excited to talk to you about.
Okay. So my name is Jenny Graham. I'm one of the founders and owners of Zealous Consulting Group. We have been in business for about 20 years now, and our focus and our passion has always started in operations and moved from there. So we do a whole variety of things to support operational excellence, including process improvement, learning, design, and delivery, implementation, broad scale implementation support, and then, finally change management. So as an organization, we tend to work in big, large initiatives, new programs that are sort of forming, and then also helping government agencies, insurance organizations make change. So change the way they work, change the way they service customers, change the way they think about the service that they provide. So that's us in like a tiny little nutshell. I'll let Maureen introduce herself.
Thanks, Jenny. My name is Maureen Valdez. I am a director with Zealous and have worked on large-scale implementations, strategy and implementations for 20 plus years. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Excellent. So just to set the stage for today's conversation, I'll share a little background. I reached out to Jenny as I've been building out the curriculum for this accelerator and training program 30 to 80. I've been reaching out to people who I worked with in government in the past to ask for feedback and input about, I know what I think works, but I've been really eager to get other people's perspectives on, what works, what has worked well, where we have divergent perspectives, and learn from those conversations. And so, Jenny's reaction, she said something like, I'll give you an earful about what it's like to, be on the operations side working with people in the product organization. And I was sort of bracing for we had a wonderful working relationship. I think very highly of Jenny and Maureen and Zealous. And, it was great. But I sort of thought I was going to hear some surprising or challenging things about how operations works with product. And to my, delight and surprise, it was so interesting hearing as Jenny was sort of going through the feedback that she had, or her perspective on when we worked together. What really emerged from that conversation for me is that everyone was at their best when we were really meeting the needs of the end users. And I think that the places where there was sometimes friction was, when people in operations, when people in the call center, for example, would perceive that they have, insights about the end user's needs, about the claimants calling into the call center, that the product organization was deaf to. And I think that, similarly on the other side, when people in the product organization feel like they're the advocate for the end user experience, that can be sort of, frustrating and challenging in working with other folks. And so I think that what is clear is that we are all at our best when we're delivering, success and outcomes, and when we are in touch with the pain points of the people we're trying to serve and meeting their needs well. And so I thought it would actually be a more interesting conversation today than to just talk about how in agreement we all are. I think that we've all observed these patterns after doing several of these projects. When you launch a new call center, when you launch a new website, when you go live with a brand new service, or new infrastructure and business processes that are new enough that it all feels new, even if the service is not new. There's sort of a common arc. Before anyone's receiving phone calls in the call center, or before there's any traffic to the website, product and contact center are not interacting that much. And then there's this burst of activity when the call center goes live and the website goes live, and all of a sudden, people have to interact with one another in a new sort of a way. And this got me thinking about Tuckman's stages of forming, storming, norming, performing. We go through all those stages. There's this burst around launch. There's inevitably some missteps. Then delivery sort of finds its rhythm and is humming. And then when capital funding goes away, there's this sort of next round of storming, forming, norming, performing. So I thought that having today's conversation in the context of that sort of arc of projects, launching new services, launching new call centers, and hearing what it's like on the contact center side, interacting with people in the product organization, I thought would be really interesting. So I guess before we dive right into the sort of storyline that I just sort of outlined, maybe we should just level set so that as we're talking and as people are listening, when I say phrases like contact center or product organization, we all know we're talking about the same things. So I wonder if you could just start us off, Jenny or Maureen, with some context. Like, how many people are in a contact center? When I talk about a contact center, how many people are we talking about?
Sure. It depends, as all good operations will tell you. But we see contact centers that are quite small. So there are some out there that are in like the 10 sort of agent range, where there's 10 or 15 or 20 people picking up the phone, helping customers, that kind of thing. And then on the sort of other end of the spectrum, you can see very large call centers. If you think of like the Deltas and the American Expresses of the world, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who comprise their call center. More commonly, we see in the like 100 to 200 to 300 range being sort of the size of a contact center that requires all the functionality and aspects of the technology that you bring to bear in a contact center. So at that size, it's pretty common that you're seeing all the components. You're seeing workforce management, you're seeing quality, you're seeing, a CRM system. So you're seeing all of the like components of sort of a full scale operation. If you're sort of south of 100 or so agents, you're probably going to see sort of a smaller technical range of capability. And ability to report, ability to slice and dice and that kind of thing for your data. So in that like 100 to 300 range is sort of what I think of as pretty typical, particularly in sort of what are considered large government programs. The federal government might sort of tip out well beyond 300, but at state government level, most states are sort of in that range.
Yep. And can you just remind me some of the different government services where you've been involved in operations and call centers?
Sure.
I think
Yes. So it's interesting. We think of ourselves as operations people, and we have a lot of deep experience in the contact center. But really, when I think of what we do, we're talking about, all things that make an organization tick. So whether that's claims processing or contact center or the people doing the work, that is what the constituents are sort of coming to the organization for. And we have done that work in state government across, unemployment insurance organizations, housing stability organizations. We've worked with departments of children and family. We've worked, across registry of motor vehicles. So there's sort of a big array of things that we have done in state government. And at the sort of common place of all of them, it's that internal operation that makes the organization tick, which is sort of our sweet spot. That's where we spend a lot of our time and energy, is in those operations to make that process work better for the staff doing the work, so that in turn they can provide an improved experience for the constituent.
Yeah, great. So for the sake of today's conversation, just to sort of keep it narrow enough to fit into an hour, I'm going to focus on call center, even though I don't want to minimize operations. Obviously, there's a world of operations beyond what happens in a contact center. I wonder if you could just tell us, surely there are people listening to this and thinking like, contact center, like, isn't everything going to be AI and chatbots? And so I wonder, when you think about 100 to 300 person call centers, supporting unemployment, healthcare, children and families. What are the kinds of activities that people do in those call centers that you don't foresee going anywhere, at least in the next couple of years, that feels like bread and butter contact center work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this journey in the contact center has been going on for probably 15 years now, when self-service really became a going concern in the service industry, right? So 15, 20 years ago, you started to see sort of simple applications of self-service starting to crop up. You saw things like IVR self-service, so you could sort of punch in a bunch of information into your phone system and it could provide you, some status or that kind of thing. And so this journey of like sort of shifting in the contact center has been going on for quite some time. One of the things that has happened in the last 15 years is we've sort of, even before AI enters the chat, right? Like we have stripped out the stuff that was very simple. So the world of a contact center is typically complex. It's typically, that top like 40 to 20, probably more like 40, like 40 to 20% of the range of things that customers are looking for. So all the simple stuff has sort of been picked off by non-AI related self-service. So as we look forward, I think, people, AI is here to sort of revolutionize basically every aspect of life, right? In some way, shape, or form. In the contact center, I think what I see coming are sort of finally getting to some of the things that make the agent experience better, which in turn makes the customer experience better. So one of my big hopes for AI is that we can do things like simply not ask a human to take the notes of how a call gets recounted, right? So when we are documenting what happened, can we not actually have humans spend time doing that? And instead, can we have humans spend time interacting with other humans? Because I think that's the piece that is on some level here to stay for a while, is that necessity for humans to talk to humans, right? So I think we have some way to go before humans are going to feel confident that a bot of some kind can converse with them and sort of give them the answers that they need. So in the contact center space, I think what that looks like is the need for those experiences that customers are having with contact centers to become even more human than they've ever been. And that means no more scripts. That means no more like if then sort of rote decision making, but instead agents who really can reach the person calling them, understand what they're asking, what they're not asking sometimes is also super important, and then be able to sort of take and compile a whole bunch of information in a way that's palatable and able to be received by the person like asking. And the other thing that I think we'll see over time is, again, we'll see some increase in like proactive information being able to be pushed out. And I think AI can play a huge role in that. But when you talk about government services in particular, you are talking about places where trust is inherently low in the consumer population. People's livelihoods are at stake. So if you're talking about, state government or federal government benefits programs, you're talking about things that are very complex and really impact somebody's livelihood. So if you're talking about unemployment insurance, if you're talking about SNAP benefits, if you're talking about retirement services like Social Security, like all of those places are places where a misstep means something significant to people's livelihoods or their ability to pay their rent or buy food for their table. And so when you have those sort of complex things where the stakes are high for the customer, I think you're going to continue to see that you're not going to see big drop-offs in call volume there in the short run. So to me, the real opportunity in like the near range is to make that experience easier and better so that people who are in these contact centers can spend time talking to people, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah, great. So now just to sort of round out the picture, help me understand where you two fit into that picture. What do you do?
So we
with
were
respect to the call
in
center?
the in the contact center realm, we do a lot of different things, but we often get involved when contact centers are either building something new, which is not super common in the contact center space, right? Like lots of contact centers exist. It's a rare occasion where you're building something brand new with a sort of contact center at scale, but like new benefit programs is a good example of where that happens. And you're seeing like a lot of paid family medical leave programs either in place now across the country or sort of in those beginning stages of becoming real. So there's some places where like building something new is not uncommon, but in the big scheme of like what we do, whether you're building something new or you're trying to bring a new feature to life, there's a huge amount of change that happens. And lots of that change impacts the people in a contact center, right? So whether it's just, I've changed the experience of the end user and they're going to call me and ask me about it, right? That's like one change that can happen. Or we're building something new, we're bringing people in who have never done this before, and we're asking them to support a new program. So the work that we do is really in helping launch or change, right? And so we are looking at what are all the things that have to happen operationally in order for that contact center to be ready to meet the demand of the customer, whether it's a brand new contact center or something that's changing. And so our team gets involved in everything from helping design the workflows and in some cases the technology experience, right? And that's where you and we've worked together to helping ready the agents through learning programs that teach them how to use the applications that are sort of being brought to bear on behalf of the customer. So I think of us as change agents, but also change makers, doers, because our team typically gets in with a client in such a way that we will help sort of get something off the ground and then turn it over, so that during that initial burst of where you need lots and lots of help and support, my team is there to do that. And then we sort of turn over the reins at some point in the future as the contact center stabilizes. So that's like in a nutshell how we get involved. We've worked with you for years now, and I think you've seen like we start as sort of talking about the agent, but quickly that becomes something else, because when you sit in that operations seat and you have that kind of purview, you have just like an endless amount of information and data that's valuable to the organization, sort of up and down every work stream.
Yep, great. So I'll just quickly add some color to the product organization side of this picture, in case anyone tuning in has different takes on what that means. So we all first worked together when I was Chief Digital Officer for the state of Massachusetts. My organization, Massachusetts Digital Service, would join projects, join organizations, to support product development type work. And so the product organization in that context includes people in roles like user experience research and design, service design, people who design, write, and test written content for, say, websites, public or logged in authenticated experience websites, people who create software-based products. So that could be configuring SaaS products, that could be extending a SaaS product like a Salesforce or a ServiceNow, that could be writing custom code for a custom web application. All of that stuff is the kind of stuff that happens in the product organization. When I talk about the product organization. Okay, so now bring us back to this idea that there's this sort of common arc. When you build a contact center that's getting ready to launch, when you build a website that's getting ready to launch, no one's calling or no one's visiting the website. The product organization and the contact center, maybe there is a very collaborative spirit between the two, but we're not really working together to support live services yet. And then, there's a go live, which may start small or may start with a big bang. Hopefully they sort of roll out slowly, but it depends still. And then there's this burst of activity and people are working together in new ways. I wonder, now that you've been to this rodeo several times, I wonder if you could just help us paint a picture of a common misstep. Maybe zoom in on one concrete example, but a concrete example that fits a pattern of missteps when you bring these two kinds of groups together for the first time right after a go live?
Sure. I'm thinking of a situation where we were launching a contact center, and in the sort of beginning stages of that launch, there was obviously, a million things to do because the contact center was going to fundamentally support an operation that took in claims. So when you talk about claims, like the processing of claims is very complex. Interfacing with a claims processing engine is even more complex usually. And the launch, we had to launch. We're locked in, right? So the date is the date. You've all heard that before. And we launched. And so when we launched, we had a really limited ability for somebody who might be able to submit their claim online to know about what's happening with their claim once they've hit the button, right? So I click this submit button and then what, right? And I'm thinking about an example where we had that situation. We launched, we were live, and then we started saying our next thing is we have to be able to tell people something about where their claim is in our process, right? Now that they've submitted it, because they're calling, and we recognize that not everybody wants to pick up the phone and call to know where something is at, but they're really curious, like, where is my claim at? This is a new thing. It's a new kind of claim. So there's, sort of education on the side of the constituent that also is happening simultaneously. And the sort of byproduct of that is lots and lots of phone calls with people saying, what is this? How do I know I did it right? And how will I know when you'll pay me, right? So there's lots and lots of angst in that process. And so lots of people calling. So one of the things I was thinking about is in that initial initiation phase, 3 months, 6 months, into a launch, we were the product teams were getting ready to launch a status component, a feature on the website, so that once you submitted a claim, it could tell you something about where your claim was headed, right, and where it was in the process. And that development sort of largely happened in a bit of a vacuum, right? So the product team was focused on the work that they were doing and really trying to, I think, manage scope, which is important when you're trying to launch something new. But didn't really sort of engage with the contact center, who was having thousands of customer interactions every single week, to say, why are people calling and what do they want to know, to inform sort of how that feature developed, and more importantly, how we prioritize all the possibilities, right? There's 100 possibilities of what you might want to know about your claim. You might want to know, did you get all of my documents? You might want to know, have you made a decision yet? You might want to know, what if I don't agree with your decision? How do I handle that? And then you might want to know, great, you made a decision. When are you going to pay me? Right? So there's a whole slew of things people want to know. And people called about each and every one of those things every single day. And so the product teams sort of, I think, were aware that the scope of questioning was so broad. And so they made some decisions about what they planned to do. And I think as they got into the development process, it became clear that they could not do all the things at the same time, right? They could not do everything all at once. But they had, in the sort of bigger scope, made some assumptions about how impactful, right, the change would be to put claim status in the hands of the constituent. And in doing that, I think they were sort of right about the potential impact of, the full suite of things. But then, as it became clear how complex the build of all of those things were, decisions got made about what we were going to do sort of first and second and then later, right? And what happened in that process is that the things that got pushed to later, they were things that you could not defer call volume without, right? So if, for example, you said to somebody, your claim has been approved, and you don't say, and you will be paid in 1 week, that's not going to sort of change the experience of the customer because they have those two questions together. Did you approve my claim? And when will you pay me, right? Like those two things are intrinsically linked. If you're the claimant, if you're the person like waiting for that answer. And so by just pushing that first question out, I think it was helpful. I think customers found it helpful to know that information, but it didn't have the impact that people were expecting because it couldn't give a complete enough answer to make that customer feel like they didn't have to call anymore. And so that's an example of like, had we worked differently in that initiation phase, which is very hard to do, because everybody is going through that like initiation, right, of all the things that happen when you launch something new. Had we worked together a little bit sooner, there were insights in the contact center that could have been very useful and might have changed like that arc of how are we going to develop this feature. If there's 10 things we want to do, which 5 are we going to do first? And what does that mean for the other 5? And I think in real time, what ends up happening is the stuff that comes later, like those last 4 or 5 things, they tend to come much, much, much later, because while the first thing is sort of stabilizing, there's a whole slew of new product developments happening that get in the way of later, right? So it's very typical. But the consequence of that is we sort of looked around and said, actually, the call volume isn't declining the way that we had hoped with the release of this feature. And I actually don't think the contact center was super surprised about that, because knowing sort of the full picture of why somebody calls, it was clear to us pretty quickly that the answer of like somebody feeling confident enough to not have to call was a little bit more complex than what we were delivering. So there was at minimum like a missed opportunity to manage expectations about how quickly those results could be realized, given the arc of the development cycle. But at maximum, we possibly could have changed the development path and sort of fully serviced a portion of customers a lot sooner than we were able to. And I think, in this like contact space, the name of the game is to give constituents, customers, an access point that they want in such a way that they don't have to sort of rely on multiple access points, right? So if somebody comes to the web, you really want them to be able to stay there. They're sort of signaling to you, I want to do my business here. I don't want to call you. I don't want to chat with you. But if they can't, you're adding friction to the story, right? For them, because they're like, I tried to go to your website and I couldn't do what I wanted to do. And so then that sort of changes their experience with whoever they are trying to reach, and sort of adds a level of friction into the mix for them, which sets up sort of how they, especially in those early stages, sets up how they think about interacting with that agency or that department or that organization for a long time. So those sort of less than flawless experiences really do make a difference in terms of like adoption, not just right in that moment for that particular issue, but in terms of how they think about and view the operation itself really for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm so eager to ask you about what does it look like when everything is humming, but I'm noticing the time. Maybe this is a good place to pause my questions and take a few questions from other folks,
Sure.
and then resume with mine. Let's see if I can get us to the screen. There. All right. How are chatbots and live chat changing call center operations?
Really good question. When I think about those two things, what I often see is organizations who have done one or the other. And really, it's very hard to do one or the other successfully. But what is changing is sort of this expectation that I have this other channel I can use if I prefer, right? I think a lot of chatbots out there get a pretty bad rap because the information that's available to the chatbot is very limited, right? So those chatbots historically have been about information, not about things you might need to know, where you have to sort of demonstrate who you are before you can access data, right? So chatbots are good for things like, what are your hours of operation, or where do I send my claim, right? So information that's sort of broadly available, the chatbot can serve that up. But generally, when somebody's trying to make contact, they're going to need that next level of information. So live chat sort of provides an interesting access point for people, and it can really change sort of how people experience the service that you provide. I think one of the things that's happening in call center operations as a result is sort of a desire to take all the information that the contact center has, which is typically a huge wealth of knowledge, and sort of expose it to a chatbot so that the chatbot can start to provide some level of information in some instances. And then live chat is like an entirely new thing. So it's very related to what contact center agents do, but the mode of communication is so fundamentally different. What you typically see is either organizations struggling to try to get agents to do both things sort of simultaneously, or contact center operations saying, we're going to support live chat, but the skill set of what we need to do that is completely different. So I tend to lean to the latter. The two platforms are quite different. And so the same fundamental information is required to be able to support the customer. But at the same time, the person who's really, really great on the phone and interpersonally in that sort of one-on-one human conversation may also not be the best person from a written communication perspective. And so the skill set is a bit different. So I think what you're seeing in call center operations is trying to find the right balance of like utilizing the same pool of resources and sort of reckoning with, is the skill set so different that becomes really, really complicated.
Great. One more here. After we automate away the easy stuff, how does this change the way you staff and train people in the call center, in the contact center?
Great question. It changes the onboarding experience dramatically, right? Because back in the old days, you could train somebody on the simple things, get them used to that, and then you could bring them back, train them on the more complex set of questions, and get them back out to the floor to be supporting the more complex stuff. What has happened is that the simple stuff really doesn't exist anymore. And so the climb for a new agent in the contact center is very significant. It's usually quite steep. So in order to sort of grapple with that, how you train people really has to change. So it has to change from being about sort of, those old school sort of show and tell models of learning, and really much more interactive, very scenario based, lots and lots of practice, and lots of practice talking to customers so that you don't actually have to practice on customers. So the need for the training program to be really top notch ratchets up every time somebody takes away something easy, right? Because that sort of climb to the first place that you can be productive on the phone gets a little bit steeper.
Cool, thank you. Okay, let's go back to my questions, and then give people a chance. We'll do another round of questions from folks tuning in just a little bit. Okay, so we started off with level set on contact center and product organization. We talked about the beginning of a project. Contact center launches, the new service and website launch. There's inevitably some missteps. You gave us the example of what that might look like. Let's fast forward, I don't know, let's say 3 or 6 months, and delivery is really humming. The contact center and the product organization have learned from mistakes like the one you described with the claim status example that you shared with us. What does it look like, day to day, practically, tactically? I wonder if you can, share another example of once things start really humming, and we're really getting it right. We're not making the kinds of misstep, that we talked about a minute ago with the claim status example. What does that look like between the contact center and the product organization?
Yeah, I can take that, Brian. It is such a different experience, and we've got, again, Jenny's example of what maybe hasn't been as ideal, and then a number of times where it really has worked just as it really should in an ideal situation. So we were at another client where several months in, as you talked about, we were kind of in lockstep and still iterating with new functionality, because you launch with MVP and there's a long list of backlog opportunities that you can work on. And one situation, we really had that seat at the table, and we were partnered with the product organization to look at enhancing self-service and automated functionality from the user interface. And as you can imagine, the ideal solution was very automated, very perfect, very limited impact internally, if not a reduction of work internally from an operations perspective. But when you looked at, of course, kind of scoping that out, you had, many story points that maybe made sense at that time. So as the work went on to really whittle down the solution to a proper MVP for that, again, we were in this perfect position where we were still at the table and really could highlight where that line in the sand was. If you don't deliver to this minimum, you're actually really going to deteriorate the operations. And yes, we knew that client at the time was very much focused on driving the most ideal customer experience first. And sometimes that decision does, in fact, really negatively impact operations. And that's a very conscious choice. So in this situation, though, by being at the table, we were really able to look at all of the features and functionalities that were kind of on the chopping block, so to speak, and say quite clearly, this is really where we recommend you define MVP. And that really can ensure that operations.
Can I just jump in? So for people who aren't familiar with the term MVP, so minimum viable product, and then you mentioned points. So I think we're talking about like story points, like an agile product team sprinting, right? Sprints are normally in like 2-week cadence, estimating the size of things and story points. So these terms are terms that we did not hear from Jenny. Is it new in your part of the story now when things are humming? Like, was that part of the shift that you're being included in that, or where? So sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to make sure.
No, not at all. So, and I can use more standard terms. So when we looked at really the scope of the work and how much work would it take for the product team to deliver this ideal perfect solution, it was just too significant of a scope. And so as we looked at refining that and really getting to that right solution, again, we were able, what makes sense to launch to the customer so that it was a great product and still really enhancing that customer experience. We were able to, again, partner and say, this should be the minimum of our solution, because that will keep operations working really, really well. And then similarly, when we talked about, in line with the other comments there, when operations and product organization have that work together and the launch is done right, then again, the contact center agents are trained perfectly well to answer a customer's questions, right? Because if the screen at my website now looks different and I have a question, I'm often going to call. And we need our contact center agents to be able to answer those questions, even if they can't see it themselves and they're not the ones doing it.
Mm-hmm. What kind, practically, tactically, what was different? Is it that someone called you earlier and said, Maureen, I'd like your input? Is it that you were taking people off the phones to have them come test something? What was going on differently between people?
Yeah. More the former. So really at the time of, or all along the process of looking at prioritizing the next round of work and what would go in, over time, what would we ask the technology vendors to build for the solution? We were involved in that prioritization. So we knew, and it gave us even better insight to what our client wanted. So we really could provide input and responses that made sense to always meeting the customer's objectives first, or our client's objectives first. And so to your point, really understanding what the client was trying to achieve, what was the experience they're trying to give the customer. And as you said, that was exactly it. We were just involved from the beginning so that we had a clear understanding of all of those things and could really partner in the solution design.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, so we've gone through the growing pains of launching something and getting people to, learn from missteps, then, work together more collaboratively, to deliver a better product together. Then this thing always happens with capital-funded projects where eventually capital goes away and the organization has to figure out how to live in equilibrium with its operating budget, hopefully continuously improve in equilibrium with its operating budget. And it's very common, very, very common that there's a lot of change in staff. Some vendors who are involved in building a thing don't stay on to support and maintain the thing. Some of the vendors who stay, people are burnt out, or people, go start a new project, and so some critical people among vendor partners change. Same thing happens inside of government. The people who are really excited about making and launching something new aren't always the same people who are feeling really passionate about operating something once it's up and running. And so there's a lot of change in people, change in size of teams. Because there's change in size of teams, the actual teams themselves frequently change. So there's this whole other burst of storming, forming, norming, performing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. So you've been through the cycle a bunch of times. I'm sure it feels like we should all sort of know how this all works, but then things change, and I think we don't always know how things work in that next stage. What can you tell us about this next stage?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it happens on every project, right? On every project, you have some, sort of dedicated group of people and money, right, to do the work that you're being asked to do. And when all of that goes away, and what's left is sort of the steady, quote, steady state operation, right? I've seen lots of different things happen, but I can think of an example where we were working with a client where we were still sort of in the mix. And just a quick background, there were two healthcare companies, they were merging. And as they merged, they had to get all of their medical management staff onto one platform, right? So there was a huge capital infusion to evaluate what was the right software that could bring everybody onto a single platform, but also could allow them, the opportunity to move forward in a cohesive way as one team, right? So we helped lead that effort. We went through the entire process of, evaluating the solution options, selecting a vendor, installing that vendor, getting everybody up and running and live. And so as we did all of that, there's lots of, it's capital funding, and there was a pretty big project team actually making that happen. So fast forward, all of that goes away, and now you're left with an organization that is in some stage of merge, right? They were not merged really, but they were merged onto a platform. And so one of the things that we did with them that was really great, and sort of an example of how it should be, is we established a structure where the operations team could really be in front of the product development discussion, so that they could be articulating, from their vantage point, what were those points of pain that they were experiencing, and what were the points of pain that the people calling them were experiencing, or the doctors they were interacting with out in the hospitals, what were their points of pain, and how do we make that process better? So, one of the things that happened that really wasn't ever on the radar was the folks who are involved in discharge planning, which is essentially if you're at a hospital, you're in a hospital stay. When you're leaving the hospital, somebody is setting you up with what you need to be successful when you go home. And that process typically has a whole slew of providers involved, right? So you may need crutches, you may need physical therapy, you may need at-home support. There's all kinds of things you could need to go home, depending on why you're hospitalized. And so that process of the doctors and nurses in the hospital saying, these are the things you need to be successful when you leave the hospital, the insurance company gets involved in all of that, because those services, can add up quickly. And the insurance company is really there to say, do you need those things? Yes or no, right? That's their job. And we can have a whole separate spirited conversation about that. But in that process, it was hugely labor intensive, and it was causing lots of friction and actual delays getting people out of the hospital, right? Because the new system went in place and really didn't do anything to change that experience. And so we were able to sort of start roundtabling with the operations teams who were on that front line every single day to basically sort of seed the research aspects of what product development teams often start with, right? Is like, what is this user research telling us that we need to better support the customer? We really were able to sort of put the leaders of the organization into that like research space to really start to drive forward priority. And out of it came a module that like allowed the hospitals to in one stop say, there's 5 things this customer needs, everything in all at once. And then when it came in the door, we were then able to have somebody look at it in totality and say, I'm going to push one button that says yes, and I'm going to say yes to all 5 of these things. And so all the services are set up sort of simultaneously. Where that process prior would have taken hours on the hospital side from the point where they knew what those services needed to be. And then it would take days on the side of the health plan to actually get to and process through all of those things. So it really sort of changed the game in terms of what was happening because we were able to sort of put the people inside the organization, but very connected to the outside in a place where they could drive product development. So when you have an operations team that's able to sort of be in the driver's seat around product development, that to me is like the perfect steady state case, because they are the people who know exactly what the customer is experiencing every single day. So they have all this information, and they just, for 25 years have been waiting to be asked, what is it that needs to happen next, right? And so we were able to put this in place, and then it gave the product teams like a clear path to sort of use their limited resources, right? Because we're in steady state, we have a limited budget. And it was really able to say, not only what can we develop, but like what is going to have the biggest impact from an organizational perspective. And all of that came into focus before we started developing instead of like during that development process. So I think the other thing that we saw was a whole lot less friction between the product teams and the operations teams, because that work was happening so collaboratively up front. So that was like an example of like how it really should go. But often it can happen quite the opposite way, where like everyone gets stretched thin and everyone stops talking to each other. So my big advice is like, you have to talk to each other more when you get to that steady state, because there's not as many translators in the process that can help sort of bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. So just to play back to you to make sure I got the the insights correctly here. So once the teams sort of thin out and capital goes away, taking advantage of operations being on the front line, being really proactive about having operations people bring pain points, bring insights from users to feed into the backlog and the priorities around what we should be improving from a product perspective. Seems like that is something that you've seen work really, really well, and that sounds terrific.
Yeah.
The other thing, which I think you're saying, but I just want to connect the dots to make sure I've followed it correctly. I think the reason that that's so different than the way it works when there's a lot of capital funding is I think early on, a lot of those insights are coming from user experience researchers who might be on the product side of the house. So before we have customers or before things are in full swing. So that is a real shift, that those insights start to emerge from more places in the organization and from places where the organization is really interacting with the end users more after go live and once things are humming.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, anytime you can actually look at what your real customers are experiencing, it's going to like the path forward is very crystal clear. It's hard when you're talking about a new organization, a new service, something that doesn't exist, to anticipate what people might want, right? That's sort of the place in the space for the user experience folks really thinking about customer insights and that kind of thing. But as soon as you have a path where you have lots and lots of customer insights, like that really can inform you more accurately than anything, sort of what will have impact, right? So if you have a question, like digging into what those customer interactions are and saying what's really happening in these interactions, that's where there's just like usually a very untapped plethora of information that can be used to sort of inform and sort of fill that need, rather than that sort of more traditional user experience research.
Yeah, awesome. So with 10 minutes left here, why don't we see if we can get a few more questions? And then in the last 5 minutes, I would love to show you both, since our last conversation, I made some updates to Milestone maps, which I'm really excited to bounce off you to see what your reactions are. Here's a question I see coming up on the screen. How do people in your organization interact with user experience researchers? I feel like you just spoke to this one. Great. Anything you want to add?
Yeah. I think we love to be working alongside user experience researchers. And I think we have done some projects where we've sort of collaborated on those conversations. And they always are so interesting when we do, because the point of view of somebody that sort of lives in operations is just very, very different than the folks who live in user experience research. And so when you can bring them both together and let them both sort of look at the feedback coming through, there's such a different set of questions that get prompted by user feedback between those two sort of different ends of the spectrum. But if you can drive out both sort of sides of the conversation when you have the opportunity to have users in front of you telling you what they think and what they want, there's just such an opportunity to get so much more out of those conversations when those two things are happening at the same, simultaneously, and there's like that cross collaboration happening. So we often either sort of help the user experience researchers get ready for their research, right, if they're doing live events, or participate in those live events and sort of take away our own insights and then get back together and say, okay, here's sort of everything that we heard. So I don't see us as, we're not user experience researchers in the same way that folks are when they're working on product development, but a lot of the work we do is very complementary. So when we can do that together, we really tend to see like sort of rapid development and rapid movement towards the questions that people are asking for.
Great. All right, one more. How do you balance the needs of the callers versus the call center agents? Internal voices are always the loudest.
Mm-hmm.
Maureen, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yes. I would actually say, you can have the loudest voice coming from both your internal voices and the external. And again, as Jenny's talking about there, when we have that firsthand information of what customers are calling about, what those questions are, where there are those frustration points or what's working well, all of that serves as really incredible information. And when I think about the story I was talking about earlier, if the client that we are working with, if the primary objective is delivering the best customer experience first, that just needs to be the lens through which we look at the work. And so our role in then training agents, providing contact center agents with the language to answer questions, or further up the path or down the line of looking at what the operational and agents are doing to do the work, really being able to articulate why some of those changes are being made, and simply clarifying that is the role, and talking about how metrics are then used internally and the expectations are different if by offering something or enabling work from a self-service or automated perspective that makes the customer experience stronger, any impact that has downstream on the agent, we're able to really, from a change management perspective, take people through that experience and articulate why that decision is being made. And again, when we're in the front of that and able to say, we're doing that because you are getting these phone calls, that's the volume of questions coming from our customers. And that's something that we need to address first. Again, it really just enables us to play this role of communicating really clearly internally why those changes are being made. So again, it's that access to that firsthand information that really lets the change management drive across the organization.
Great. Okay, thank you both. There's so much more I'd love to ask. Since we've got only a little bit of time left, I really want to show you something. So if you're willing and don't mind being put on the spot, there's a tool that we've all used together called a milestone map, which, among other things, we have used to get people in the product organization and the operations side of the house, to actually get together and collaborate on roadmaps and, track work in progress and make adjustments together. And, in our last conversation, you said something that really stuck with me. And, you've heard me say probably till you're tired of hearing it, I really want to get people literally on the same page. I like to make sure that we can all see the same finish line and we all know when we're crossing it. And so, you shared this story with me about one of you had just gotten off a phone call with someone who said something like, what about call volume? We did all this work on call volume, and there were a lot of different perspectives. Had we deprioritized work on reducing call volume? Had the feature development not achieved its objectives? It sounded like different people sort of saw different things in these sort of end results. And so, I really want everyone to be able to see, crystal clear the same thing. So there's an update I made. Let's see if I can figure out how to share my screen here. You'd think I know how by now. There it is. There's an update I made to a new version of Milestone Maps, and I want to show it to you to see if you think this meets the need better. All right, are you all seeing my Milestone map here? No.
Not yet. Oh, here it comes.
There it is.
Got it.
Okay, so let me see if I can, let me see what you think of this. So here is a picture of what I think you all were describing, when we had that conversation. So here it says, reduce calls to the call center. This is an example, it makes it a little bit bigger. This is an example of a 1 quarter view of a milestone map. So like week to week or sprint to sprint. And you can see as the quarter progresses, tracking status, everything starts green. Inevitably, things sort of turn yellow and people figure out how to adjust, hopefully get it back to green. And at the end of the quarter, this is where everyone wants to be. Each work stream is reporting that they've achieved, delivered the key results for whatever the objectives are on each of those rows. And so I think the experience that, you all were having was, here we see a heading that says reduce calls to the call center. We see, a cross-functional effort, enable claimants to do X on the website without making a phone call. Reduce confusion by making X more intuitive. Train contact center staff on new functionality and recommendations. So all of this good work happens, and all of this good work, delivers whatever, people were hoping to deliver. And if we look at, a 1 year view rather than a 1 quarter view, I think the story looks something like this. Reduce calls to call center is a big heading. You can see here 2 quarters worth of work where, each 2 quarters in a row, people are, delivering feature enhancements and training the contact center and everything's green. But the calls to the call center haven't actually gone down. So even though the outputs that people were targeting are getting delivered on time and sort of as expected, the calls to the call center haven't actually gone down, and that is not visible here. And so you can imagine a scenario where, it's the end of the year, we're having a review with the executives, and, some executive is saying, what happened to call volume? How come that hasn't gone down? And I think, Jenny or Maureen, you're probably looking at this, the last 2 quarters of the year where we stopped working on it. And from being, working with people in the call center, the call volume never went down, and it feels like we deprioritized it because we stopped working on it. And then it's also totally understandable that, some director is like, why hasn't the call volume gone down? We did all this work. So here's before I show you the new feature, is that a fair sort of recap of, have I understood the story and the problem correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so in the next version of Milestone Maps, the idea is, so it's a subtle change, but hopefully a really impactful one. If you look on the left, in the versions of these that I've been using over the past many years, the left always sort of remained black, and the right is where all the sort of stoplight colors were. So on the right, the idea is, in the new version, in version 3, we're still looking at the 1 year view. Now the color coding is getting reflected on the objectives side of the map, and not just at the level of individual work streams, but on the level of, the outcomes that they roll up to. So here you can visibly see, the 3 work streams with the different outputs that all have the, intent of reducing calls to the call center. And then, calls to call center, even if we're red at the end of this first quarter, maybe that's expected because it's sort of, we just released some changes. It takes time. And maybe it's only at the end of the next quarter that you can sort of see if we're having an impact or not. Even if the indicator is sort of delayed, this gives us a way to sort of surface and visualize over the whole next quarter, let's say, are we starting to see our changes having an impact? And my hope would be that you get to the end of quarter 3, and when you're having the quarterly review with executives or whoever, it's crystal clear to everyone that even though we delivered all the features we expected, the call volume hasn't gone down, and hopefully this is prompting a conversation before the last quarter about do we want to reprioritize working on this problem? Do we need to do something more to try to affect the outcome that we were targeting? Does this hit the mark? Are you guys into this?
I like it, actually. One of the hard things I think for product teams, based on sort of how they interact with the operation, they have to be so focused on the thing that they're working on right now. And once it's delivered, and they've moved on, right? They're moving to the next thing. So in all fairness, that change that they just spent, a month working on is out of sight, out of mind. It's done, it's over, and they've moved on to the next thing. And I think that's okay from a day-to-day perspective. But when you sit back and you say, we delivered this thing, did it have the impact that we wanted? Having that be front of mind in the milestone map, I think does a lot to sort of change that conversation, both for the features that maybe aren't quite there yet, right? And it can allow us to say, we need to prioritize some more work here. But also, as they think about their next feature that they're building, having that input of did this work the way I wanted it to or not is super important as they go on to the next feature. Because what you don't want is product teams that sort of if there is a misstep, you don't want them to make the same misstep again and again and again. You want them to sort of be able to say, oh, okay, that didn't work exactly the way that we thought it would. Why? And now how do we avoid that in this next iteration, right? So simply being able to say, is the output what we intended in this visual way that is sort of a native tool that product teams use every day is a really easy way to keep everybody on that outcomes focused page.
Great. All right. That's the feedback I was hoping for.
Yeah.
Maureen, would you like to add anything before we wrap up here?
Yeah, no, just on the same token, but I think what really is helpful about that is, to your point, it prevents the conversation from kind of falling off the map, so that 6 months later, when that question is asked, there's the visual aid from there that the information was right in front of us all along. And when was the last time we went to a meeting where the giant red bar was not mentioned or asked about? So it really simply just keeps it front of mind so that it doesn't fall off the table from a discussion perspective. So I think that really does help.
All right, great. Well, thank you both so much. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. This is really fun. Really appreciate you making the time to be here. And
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
So happy to have you. And so for folks who are here, I wonder if we have a feedback link that we can send people to. Usually we flash that in the background. Okay, here it is. I guess you can't see our faces while you're looking at the link. Here's a bit.ly link to a feedback form. Please, if you tuned in for this conversation, if you would take one more minute to go to this link. I think you can probably also click it below wherever you're watching this video. Would love to get your feedback. Would love to make sure that we're making the best use of everybody's time when we're here. And if you've got suggestions about how we can make these conversations more useful, we love getting feedback. So thank you so much. See y'all next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.